the first Neurodiversity Natter webinar that I've run. I'll give a really quick introduction into myself and then hand over to our first guest to introduce themselves. But for those of you who don't know me, I'm Claire Kerry, founder of the Neurodiversity Network. I'm the host of this webinar, and I ran a conference last month. I can't believe it was only sort of a month ago. It feels like a lifetime ago now. But some of you attended that, and our guest did as well. So for anyone that's recognised his face or his name, he was one of our panellists on day one, Neurodiversity in Education. But the reason I set up this webinar was to continue sort of the great conversations that we had in the room and also on social media before and after the event, and to pick up some of the conversations with some of the speakers and exhibitors that were there. As mentioned, Pete was one of our panellists on day one, Neurodiversity in Education, and thank you so much for joining us on this first webinar. So would you like to introduce yourself to people that may not have attended or may need a reminder?
Absolutely. I probably need a reminder myself, Claire. So my name's Pete Jarrett, and I've done a few things in my life as what my mum used to describe me as, but essentially I started life as an ecologist, went into teaching as a science teacher. And because of my own dyslexia and a later diagnosis of ADHD, it became very apparent very quickly that the dialogue around neurodiversity that still hadn't moved on massively from when I was young and studying at school. So I ended up doing more and more maths teaching, particularly with people that struggled, and also trained as a specialist teacher and assessor. And my main focus is maths learning difficulties and dyscalculia. So I'm on the advisory board of the Dyscalculia Network. I was part of the two SAS working groups on definitions of, well, I've been on the two working groups on the definitions of dyscalculia, and I was sort of adjacent to the definition of dyslexia. But increasingly, and this comes back to my first career, I'm doing more work around the understanding, the complexity that's inherent in cognitive difference, and some of the categories overlap so much, and how we actually navigate that really from a sort of complex systems data science always. But really, I think most people know me as a nice man, bad.
Great introduction. And Dyscalculia Network, just because you mentioned that as one of the strands, was an exhibitor at the conference as well. So highly recommend, as I'm sure you do, to go and check out those resources for anyone that wants more information in that area.
Absolutely. And I've got excellent resources. I've got to say this, but I'm currently in India with Rob Jennings, who's the founder of the Dyscalculia Network, or one of the founders, and he's just next door. But what I particularly like about the work that Dyscalculia Network does is the fact that they have adults with dyscalculia from a range of professions who really add the value to the network, but also it allows the voice of people with a condition, careful use of the word condition, but people to actually sort of advocate for themselves and feel that they're not alone. I think to calling this maths was that there are some overgeneralizations about difficulties with maths and the people who really struggle because of cognitive difference. That can be a bit evaluating. But we'll come to that.
I was going to say, you've mentioned the title of your webinar topic that you're going to be talking about today, and mentioned that it's a case study on neurodiversity, learning and emotion. Would you like to give a bit of an overview of that and why you picked that as a topic you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, so I think it's really important that we recognise that alongside the specific presentations of a condition, there are a lot of other variables that have an impact on both the impact of the cognitive difference and how people feel about it and how it's understood in the wider community. And I think maths is actually a really good, and numerical cognition is generally a really good case study, because we've all experienced maths. We all have an opinion. We've watched people who can do it. We've watched people who can do it at different times in their lives. We all understand that there are aspects of the way we teach maths, or the expectations on how we assess maths. Don't get me started on times tables tests, that actually are not measuring context knowledge. They're measuring things like cognitive function. So I said, don't mention the times table test, but I'm going to do it. So mathematical fluency is being able to store useful information in your head, but that's not just the times tables facts. That's how to use those facts to calculate other facts. And I always say 12 times 17 is a really good example of that, because that sounds a really inaccessible multiplication problem, but actually if you times 17 by 10, that is more accessible. And then you have to double the 17 again and add that on, so that if people have the flexibility to work with numbers and have a reasonable amount of information stored, they find it accessible. But we move the curriculum forward so quickly, and we have this maths is expected to be done in your head, it's expected to be done quickly, and that creates anxiety in its own right. And maths anxiety is a very good conference, first conference on maths anxiety happening at Cambridge next year. And I think also we have lots of societal perceptions of mathematics being difficult, and people saying, oh, I'm not very good at maths as well. So we're really wrapped up in perhaps we don't teach the right way, that people have different expectations or perceptions of what maths is like. A parent will say to a child, don't worry about it too much. I don't use the builder. I don't use maths much in my day-to-day life. You won't need it. And in fact, we had a conversation last night here about people see maths as being something that's done in school, and all the working with numbers they do then in their daily lives, they don't actually see us connected to it. And some people say, oh, I'm not very good at maths because I have to write it down as well, because dyslexia and ADHD, my working memory isn't particularly efficient. So I think it sits as a really good example. And I think because there is such a strong kind of feeling either that you can't do it, really wraps in all of those environmental things and shows off the complexity. And I've just rattled on for far too long. So I'll leave you to it.
No, it's really insightful. I can see people sort of listening, nodding along as well, which is really nice to see. So
that's the thing. I think whether you teach maths or you've learned maths or you try to guide your child through maths as it's done in the school, we've all had experience of it. And I think all of us appreciate it could be done better in different ways.
I think a lot of people will have that lived experience, like you said, whether it's their own or through supporting a child, maybe. You mentioned sort of a few different areas, and some of them we'll circle back on, particularly sort of around the emotion side. I know you wanted to touch on that more. You also talked about teaching styles and also sort of perceptions of it as well. What would you say is the biggest challenge in this area?
I think at the moment, there are a number of challenges, depending on where in the system you look at. I think we have to be honest and say that whilst we are on a journey of discovery around the neuroscience of numerical cognition, we aren't there. We don't know the relationship in terms of genetic profiles across the board with neurodiversity and curriculum. Somebody's just said Michael Gove's curriculum, and I'd be inclined to agree that actually two things are wrong that we tend to do in the UK. One is that it's improving, but we teach mathematics as a process rather than thinking of the way that the brain makes sense of number. And I think although we are beginning to take on the evidence from neuroscientific cognitive psychological studies, in the UK, we have a tendency to have practicums around certain approaches to teaching, and we're in a maths mastery, concrete pictorial abstract fashion at the moment. And I think because it's fashionable, we don't always fully engaging with an approach for a long period of time. And everybody said, well, look, we're following a Singapore method, but Singapore is different culturally, but also they've been doing it for 25, 30 years. And I know I look really young, but in the time that I've been involved in the maths classroom, which is a frighteningly long period of time, I've seen things come and go, and some of the good stuff just gets chucked in the bin. So I think actually, and it's interesting to note that SEND review has been slightly delayed because of wanting to understand more from parents. But one of the things that's been coming through quite strongly on that is that, and this is interesting because it applies to India as well, initial teacher education needs more focus on the psychology of learning, not on the process of teaching, but on the psychology of learning, how people learn in different environments. And I think if all teachers understand how it should work, it would be easier for a teacher to spot when it's not working. And that's essentially the point at which we have to manage an intervention in the classroom, start talking to, and somebody putting up some really good comments, and Maslow for balloons. And I mean, in a way, I think actually we do, an interesting point, but we do tend to use models that are right, but have been around the psychology sort of for a long time, but we don't back that up with how we now know they're right from contemporary research, which is really interesting. So I think I am hopeful from some of the consultations that I've been involved with around the curriculum review and understanding SEND, that there might be some changes to initial teacher education. So I think that probably sits at the heart of it. And with that, it's about evidence-informed approaches. We've got to have a better relationship between educators and research.
Really interesting points. And when you talk about psychology and around that side, I'll be completely honest, that is all new to me. So if anyone's sat on this course thinking that's new to them, I was diagnosed with dyslexia when I was at university, so I missed the understanding and the support and things in my primary and secondary education. If somebody is on this call and it is sort of new to them, or they're thinking how can they support their own learning, or if they're supporting a child through maths and learning, what would be a good sort of starting point for them to research or look at?
So that's a really good question. And I think it is always daunting to engage with this. So I'm going to lump for something that is maths specific. And as I say, I think maths is a really good model to from, if you like. We understand numerical cognition. It's less complicated than, for example, all the things that can impact on reading in terms of phonological awareness and working memory. They all apply to mathematics. And an excellent book, the second edition, has just been published by a gentleman called Professor Butterworth, who is the emeritus professor of cognitive neuroscience at UCL. And UCL have always done some really good work around this. And he's worked over the years, he really sort of created globally, I think, an understanding of the neuroscience of numerical cognition. But he worked with people like Jutta Frith, who's contributed so much to our understandings of dyslexia and other conditions. And so he comes from a lab that is particularly good. And the book is called Dyscalculia from Science to Education. And it's written specifically really for relatively easy access for people that are not fully embraced in the nerdy world of neuroscience and cognitive science, but it is totally evidence-based. And Brian explains these things in really well, and he talks about lived experience. So I think particularly for an educator or for well-informed parent, and lots of parents of people with neurodiversity are educators as well, that's actually, I would recommend as a good starting point. And I'm going to send Brian a message now and tell him that I need some feedback from him for my tracking. But also actually thinking about it, the Dyscalculia Network has some really good stuff. Left the university to do a lot of stuff. And there are books around on the psychology of learning and the impacts of the environment on that.
That's really great. Sorry to put you on the spot there. That's really useful. And we'll share the links as well. If people didn't catch the names of the books, then I can share the link for the Dyscalculia Network as well. You mentioned the book was Dyscalculia Science to Education, but I'll look out the link and share that as well. That's really great.
I'll just send it straight to you. So 21st century. I'll just WhatsApp it to you after the podcast.
All the way from India.
All the way from India, and it'll arrive instantly.
One of the other things that you've briefly mentioned, but I know that you were keen to share, was around the emotions around learning and also maths in schools. What is your sort of insight into that?
So I think there's a reason that a lot of people feel discomfort around mathematics, and it's actually not the working with the numbers, it's the confidence of certainly doing it in the right way. And then it's also about the environment the teacher creates in terms of blame. And I'm going to give you an example from a lesson I observed 17, 18-year-olds in India a week ago, because it's less controversial then. But the teacher asked the student who was working hard to understand a concept and the process that would allow that concept to be used, to come up and work through some problems on the board. And the guy did so willingly, and he was watching the board, just processing the information. And the teacher said, "Come on, it needs to be quicker than this. We haven't got all day." And then about 15 seconds later, because that had obviously impacted with the guy's kind of thinking, he just pulled somebody up, and the poor guy that was struggling to concentrate process was just pushed to one side. And when he came to sat down, I tapped him on the shoulder, because he was sitting just in front of me, and sort of said, I can see that was difficult. And he literally said to me, "I just need time to think." And when we think about, we have this construct of normal that we apply to the learning environment. Not a very good book about neurodiversity more generally is a political book, is The Empire of Normality by Robert Chapman, who's a philosopher at the University of Durham. And he explores how we have built this concept of normal. And of course, the medical model of neurodiversity is based on that sort of measuring outside of a standard deviation in a way that excludes people, because we're only measuring in one thing. But research that I've done, not so much on anxiety, there's a very good team at Derby University, Tom Hunt, some of you will know, and it's worth looking, just sort of putting mass anxiety University of Derby into Google, and it'll chuck everything up. But I've done quite a lot of work on self-efficacy in the classroom, so what people believe they can do. And I've also done some work on what they remember about teachers. And the things that people feel the least confident about in terms of the mathematics problem, this isn't about dyscalculia, this is generally having to answer quickly, having to answer in front of the whole class, having to stand up in front, work on the board. And then fourth is division. So it's not until we get to the fourth thing that people find difficult, and division is one of those things that is taught very early on, but actually it's probably not necessarily taught in a way that builds strong memories. So we understand division, fractions, percentages, algebra. Those are the things that people remember with dread. But it's the environment the teacher creates. And the work that Tom and another colleague of his, Dominic Petronzi, have done as well, is also shows that actually the teaching environment is as much of an issue as the numbers you're working with. And so if we lead then into the work that I've done, which was actually based on a conversation I had with my daughter about what she remembered about her teachers, and she had a fairly large social media network. So we just went out. So it was literally a random Facebook sample of, and it was about 300 people by the end of it, who were all involved in an online sales group. So there was a whole range of socioeconomic backgrounds, there was a whole range of educational outcomes. It's a fairly diverse group. The things that came through most strongly in terms of what people remember about their favourite teacher was empathy. They got them. They explained things in ways, different ways that I understood. And it seems so simple, really, that if you think about giving people time to allow their brains to work, because if we're saying normal, if we take a hard line at 50% on a normal distribution curve, what we're actually saying is that 50% of the learners aren't there. And but somebody's working memory, it takes them longer to process information. And they're going to start feeling uncomfortable because they don't have the time to think. I remember when I was at school, my trick was, because it was blackboard, painted blackboards with chalk in those days. I used to write down when we had to copy from the board, I'd write down the first 3 lines, I'd miss the middle bit out, and I'd write down the last 3 lines, so that I finish at the same time as everybody else. Because the most important thing to me, as a 12-year-old, was not being the child that was still going, that the teacher tuts at because they're not doing it. And I mean, The maths classroom has got even more of that kind of, you've got to do it now, you've got to do it now. This creates the anxiety. Just for teachers to recognise that they need to build foundations and they need to give people time to think. And if people aren't, and they scaffold that with information, all of those things are really important. This is the reason why teaching in initial teacher education about the psychology of education, because the psychology, of learning, and it's really important, it's the psychology of learning, it would just allow a teacher to do what an expert teacher does, which is to observe really well and start to problem solve around that. And I think if we can do that in our classrooms, we will reduce the anxiety, we will create better learning environments, but actually we will also concentrate on what's really important in a maths classroom, which is the foundations of mathematical cognition and how those relate to the content. So that's my rant over there.
No, it's really interesting. And when you break it down like that, it does sound really simple. And I appreciate it's much harder in practice. But I think, I know there's added complexities, but it's almost like with anything that if you're building someone's sort of confidence up, and someone mentioned in the comments about sort of a growth mindset, if you've been put in situations, especially as a child, where you think you're stupid or you don't believe you're capable or you don't believe that you can do it quick enough, you've already got that perception going into that situation before you've even started.
We're understanding that self-efficacy, self-confidence, metacognition, all of those things. So the in-self understanding of how you can operate in the learning environment have the greatest impact. And actually the growth mindset thing is a perfect example in the UK of taking an incredibly good idea, but quite complex when you start to dig it and start making it the posters on the wall without actually modelling growth mindset in terms of the teachers. There was a phase which was gone where it was just, oh, you've got to have a growth mindset, with so many teachers not really working out how to model that.
I'm conscious of time. We've got 2 more minutes left. If you were going to give one piece of advice or one takeaway, is there one thing you can summarise in 60 seconds that you'd like someone to take away from this conversation?
So I think in terms of supporting people more generally with maths learning, but certainly supporting people with specific difficulties around mathematics, go back to the foundations of mathematics, and it's making sure that at every stage you scaffold learners' understanding of the magnitude, the size of the number. So cardinality is the language that we use, and then the order of numbers. And I think if we move on from that so quickly, I just think just keep going back to how the brain makes sense of number in terms of magnitude relationships and the order, and scaffold that with things like number lines and place value tools and things. And again, it's really simple. Very quickly, actually, we just did some work with some nursery school attached to the school. They were teaching counting by putting their fists on top of each other. That's sort of notionally good. We've just swapped them now to counting using their fingers when they're singing songs.
Great, that's really
Barnaby
useful.
says, keep concrete or pictorial, but keep resources, keep those scaffolds there.
Great, thank you. As mentioned, I will share sort of a recording of this, and I'll get together some of the links and things that were mentioned. But thank you so much for joining the first conversation, and thank you so much, Pete, for being our first guest. I hope you have all
No
as much
pressure to either of us. No pressure, but it's been great fun. Thank you. I've really enjoyed ranting.
No problem. I'll let you enjoy the rest of your holiday. Well, it doesn't sound like holiday. It sounds like
It's
you've been doing
work.
lots of
It's
work.
work.
Sorry.
It is work. I'm on holiday this week because it's Diwali, but tomorrow's back in the office.
Oh, perfect. Well, I look forward to catching up with you when you're back and finding out everything that you've done. And we'll be doing another Neurodiversity Natter same time next week. So you're welcome to join. For anyone that's signed up, you'll get a reminder for that. But thank you so much. Nice to see you all again, and hopefully speak to you soon.